Hello everyone, Cynthia here with another Rambler, and today I want to talk about kind of a difficult topic in some regards. I want to talk about things like bigotry and prejudice, and also probably touch on why representation matters in the course of this. Now, I'm going to be looking at this from more of a sort of philosophical standpoint, so not actual examples necessarily per se of like, this is an example of bigotry, but more talking about the underlying idea of what's going on here. And a lot of this comes from sort of self-observation and other things as well, and just thinking about the topic. So I'm absolutely willing for people's input, especially from personal anecdote. So there's an important sort of starting point, which is a term that I'm going to use throughout this, which is observable characteristics. So this is important because this is kind of a foundation of how prejudice and bigotry kind of form. So an observable characteristic is a characteristic of a human being that can be observed easily. So, in other words, you don't necessarily learn about it by talking to them for a long period of time, but there is method and pattern of speech, so how somebody sounds when they talk. That's an observable characteristic. How they dress, the color of their skin, the shape of their eyes, the shape of their ears, overall anatomy, hair color, things like that, level of grooming, odors, any of those sorts of things. Basically, things that we observe. Gait, for example, is another observable characteristic. So these sorts of things, potentially also things that they're engaging in. For example, if somebody is listening to music and, they're listening to that music for themselves sort of thing, that can be an observable characteristic. What they're eating, if they're eating something. All of these things can work as observable characteristics. But it's basically anything that you can observe about a person without actually engaging with them directly or engaging with them in a way to get to know who they are. So the reason why this concept of observable characteristic is important is because we, as human beings, intrinsically want to try to categorize things. There's lots of different reasons why we do this. Some of them is to try to identify potential positives for us, and another big one is potential negatives. For example, something that might be dangerous. So what we're going to do when we interact with other people, because other people have a potential to be positive for us or negative for us, is we try to figure out as quickly as we can whether or not we think somebody's going to be a danger. Because a positive is fine, that's great, but a danger is more immediate. A threat is a more immediate problem. Now, there's something else that's going on here, too, which is that the brain doesn't like to deal with no information. It's hard for us to want to work with saying, I don't know, this is an unknown, I don't actually know anything about this. So on its own, the brain will take these observable characteristics and try to use them to categorize and identify who somebody is. This is the root of prejudice, in my opinion. So as a good example, if I see someone, say, wearing a particular type of outfit, say a suit, perhaps, I'm going to categorize that person based upon that. Now, here's the important part, and this is where representation plays a very significant role. How I categorize that person depends upon how the categories have been set up in my mind. And that's based upon what I've been taught as I've grown up. So what have I observed? What associations have been formed in my mind between, say, this particular observable characteristic, such as wearing a suit, and what I think of, or what I've been taught in many regards, what I've observed, been taught, shown, what's been represented to me about suit wearers, people who wear suits, right? Normally we associate a certain type of suit with like a businessman, for example, or a business person, somebody doing business, or a politician. Usually there's a level of authority, rank, prestige, honor associated with wearing a suit. So that means that observable characteristic is likely to give me, in a prejudicial sense, that is prejudging, right? I'm judging them before I know them to actually make an informed opinion. And that there allows me to make some sort of opinion about that person. Now, that prejudgment could be very, very wrong. They aren't always, but they often can be quite wrong. But they're our starting point. And so they're kind of the default value for the blank in our brain about that person. So we can use that particular aspect of dress to fill in that blank somehow. Now, the important thing is that we have to be very careful to make sure that that blank can be overwritten. Because when we go in and interact with a person, we have a bunch of blanks about them. But when we interact with them, we can begin filling in those blanks with real information. For example, we can fill in real information about what they're like, what they like, as opposed to what they are like, what they actually think, what they want to do, all of these sorts of things, basically who they actually are, not what the prejudice is, not what the assumption is, as it were, based upon these observable characteristics. Now, representation matters because it is part of what helps build up the framework that we use for filling in those blanks with observable characteristics. It's how we fill in our assumptions. So, for example, if you've never been shown a person in a particular environment, then seeing them in that environment means that your brain may not know how to use them. If you have been shown them, then your brain's going to use that. But that might be wildly inaccurate. So just to use some really stereotypical example, if you've only seen an Asian individual portrayed in a movie as a kung fu master for whatever reason, let's just roll with this particular example, then you might see Asian people as likely to be good at kung fu, particularly if they look fit. And there's no basis for that. There's no reason why any given person should be good at kung fu, but that is kind of what you have as a baseline assumption, and that may or may not have something about how dangerous they are. So this is where you can see very important things with like dress styles, styles of clothing. These can become associated with certain types of people in terms of what has been presented to us in media. So for example, you might associate with a certain type of outfit with a dangerous individual, and that becomes linked in your mind. So when you see that, the assumption then becomes this type of person is likely to be dangerous because they're dressing in a way that to my brain reads dangerous, because that's the assumption that I have based upon what has been presented to me about that observable characteristic. And especially with something like dress, which is to some extent a choice. Obviously, there can be financial limits on it and certain practical limits. For example, wearing, say, a bikini in the middle of winter outside is less than practical. But that sort of thing factors into it a little bit. But we tend to then take this and extrapolate. So what then happens with bigotry, and I want to be very clear that with bigotry and prejudice, we usually focus on the negative, right? We usually focus on the negative sort of things. So, for example, something like the bigotry that I'm trying to find a good example, but I mean, they're all terrible, right? This is the problem. I can't just like throw one out there and not have it be terrible. So, for example, a prejudice against, say, low-hanging pants as being a criminal. The sort of pants hanging off partway down, or whatever. Hopefully you have the idea of what I'm talking about. That's associated with criminal for a lot of people, particularly in white America, which is where I come from. And that association has been built up. That's a negative idea of that particular trait. But there's positive ideas of them. You couldn't see my finger quotes, but the positives are usually never actually positive. But for example, Asians are good at math is a stereotype. People being good at math is just an individual trait of how their brain works. I've certainly observed that a lot as I do math tutoring, and whether or not somebody's Asian has no particular influence on that one way or another. But that's a positive sort of stereotype or prejudice. And that doesn't do any favors to Asian people who aren't good at math or any of that sort of thing. It creates an unfair expectation. But that's kind of like a positive example in my invisible finger quote style. So we have to be careful about both positive and negative. Now, what I think of as bigotry is when we refuse to allow prejudice to be overwritten by fact. I'm feeling out the kind of the feel for it. I wrote down earlier, actually, and I think this is another way to look at bigotry. So I wrote down earlier when I was just kind of doing some initial notes, this sentence: bigotry is treating someone like something other than human, whether positive or negative, based on observable characteristics. I think that there's a certain amount of immutability or resistance to changing that opinion as well. Now, I say something other than human, whether positive or negative. So there can be a very positive spin on this, for example, is treating someone as better than human, which is kind of like almost a deification of someone, or negative, so less than human, subhuman. So either superhuman or subhuman based on observable characteristics. So this is often not knowing who they are or not caring. Basically, I view bigotry as the extended form of prejudice, where prejudice is working off of assumptions that aren't being filled in, and then bigotry is either refusing to allow those to be filled in or kind of a blanket application, kind of in some regards refusing to allow prejudices to be replaced by fact. So, the fact of who someone is. So, when we treat somebody as something other than human, we're doing a disservice to them in one way or another. Either if we're treating them as subhuman, then we're not treating them properly like a human being, giving them the full rights that they ought to have, the full benefit of the doubt, or other sorts of, basically we don't treat them in a humane way. But when we deify somebody, then we also do not treat them like a human being. We often make them less fallible than they are is a good example. Or we remove human-like traits that we tend to think of as negative from them, for example. So that's part of often basically deifying somebody as saying, they're less prone to fallibility. They're less likely to make mistakes or errors or be wrong or do something bad. Less fallible is really what it often comes down to. Or we think of them as better somehow, which is also often in error. So we have to be careful of this either way, and bigotry is definitely a bad thing. Now, I want to take a moment here also to address something else, which I think is really important in any of these conversations. We have to differentiate between bigotry and bullying. And the reason why I say that is there is a tendency with bullying to specifically, because the goal of being a bully is to hurt someone, right? Often to pass on pain, but the goal is to inflict pain on someone else, emotional, physical, whatever. We have to be careful with bullies to not assume bigotry, because bullies will often try to use whatever they think will inflict the most pain in order to do so. Therefore, they may use bigotry-oriented language, for example, racist or sexist language, not because they are themselves necessarily racist or sexist, but because they believe that that will inflict the most pain. And I think that it is important to be careful to not muddy things too much and to call out bullies as bullies rather than necessarily trying to make the assumption that they're racist or sexist or whatever. This is just something that bothers me because I feel like there's too much of an impugning of motives, and as weird as it may seem, I think it's more proper to accuse somebody of bullying if that is what they are doing than to try to label them with some sort of bigotry-related label, in part because it dilutes that label. So, for example, people who know that person, they might say, well, I know this person isn't really a blankist, whatever you want to put in there, and therefore that label doesn't make any sense. How many other people have had this label thrown at them where it's not true? That's one way that it can be diluted as an example. But regardless, when somebody is being cruel on that issue, their bullying should be addressed, I think. So I'm not saying that they shouldn't be addressed. I want people to be careful of making the assumption that somebody's using bigotry-type language, and I'm probably dwelling on this point too long, but it's just something that to me, for some reason, is a bit of a pet peeve, I guess. It's not quite the right phrase, but I feel like it makes too much of an assumption to say that the person is doing something out of a bigotry-motivated reason rather than just because they are a bully and a jerk. So it's splitting hairs to some extent, but for some reason that bothers me. Anyway, I've gone on too long on that particular point. So I think I've kind of expressed a lot of what I was wanting to try to say with this. So the first is that as human beings, we want to fill in the blanks. We want to try to identify if somebody's going to be a danger to us in particular. And we also just don't want to work with unknown information. So we want to fill in that information, and our brains use what we have basically been told in the past. That's why representation matters. Representation is super important because it informs that assumption center of our brain. It says, oh, I assume this. And what's important is to try to make sure that we, A, can update the assumption center of our brain. So not just assuming something about a group without allowing that to be updated with new information. So we're always going to make assumptions about groups. So let's try to make those assumptions as not inaccurate as we can. It's always going to be wildly inaccurate, but trying to reduce the wildness of the inaccuracy from 270 degrees to 110 degrees, is an improvement. So we can at least be a little bit more accurate. And then wanting to make sure that when we make those prejudices, we don't operate on them necessarily, allowing them to be overwritten by fact, right? And that means allowing ourselves to get to know somebody, and also to avoid the treatment of others as not human, either through deification or treating them as subhuman. Both of those are actually bad things, and for a number of different reasons. And also, I just want to be clear that treating a subhuman can be done from either a positive or negative light. So it can treat somebody as subhuman, therefore you treat them badly because you don't think that they're worthy of being treated like a human being. But it can also look like it's a positive, where you're coming at it from a protective angle, where you're saying, oh, you're less than human, therefore you need my protection. And this often looks positive but is actually negative, and typically it removes agency. Now, there are some times where this has to be done from an adult to a child standpoint, and that is a different sort of power dynamic than what I'm discussing here. For some reason, it felt important to bring that up. So anyway, hopefully that this has been an interesting discussion. I would absolutely love to be at Launching Point. I'd like to hear people's thoughts and opinions on this particular issue. This is a different angle of approaching it, I hope, than what a lot of people have done. I don't know, but those are my thoughts on the issue, and I definitely observe myself where I have this assumption center, and it makes certain assumptions, and I can see that when I get to know somebody, I see them and not the set of assumptions I have about their observable characteristics. And that's kind of what I'm trying to get at here, is that we have these assumptions that we make about people based upon observable characteristics or even labels, things like conservative, liberal, progressive, political ideologies. We make assumptions based upon what people have as their observable characteristics or other labels that we have about them. And that leads us to make assumptions about them. And if we don't actually talk with them and engage with them, then we're acting either in prejudice or bigotry, depending upon how willing we are to let those be overwritten. And all of us will do this because it is the nature that we work with. All of us do not know somebody when we first meet them. All of us will look at the characteristics of that person that we can observe, and we will build assumptions in our mind based upon what's been presented to us. And if what's been presented to us is too narrow or too broad or full of error, then we're always going to run into wrong assumptions. And I know that for myself, I've had to work to try to change some of the assumptions that I was given to accept a broader swath of things potentially, or a narrower one, depending upon the situation. And it's a challenging task. But working to overcome the negative impact that our assumption centers can have on us and our ability to relate to each other, and seeking to try to treat each other as human beings, is a worthwhile endeavor. So that's where I think I want to end it. So until next time, you can contact me directly through email by emailing me at scientir@gmail.com. You can like me on Facebook at facebook.com/scientiersramblers, and you can support me on Patreon at patreon.com/scientir. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.